In this video, we will create the private link service and private endpoint for the private link service. Before doing this, let's understand the architecture. We will create two virtual networks in the same subscription. One is VNet provider network and the another one is VNet consumer network. Remember, we are going to simulate provider and consumer in the same subscription. Okay. But in reality, this could be in a different subscription sometimes, right? Or in a different tenant altogether, right? That is how these private link services will work, because there is some provider for the service and there are multiple consumers, right? For the service actually. So we got one VNet provider, one VNet provider network. And in the VNet provider network, we got two subnet. One subnet, we calling it as subnet provider, where we will have a front end for the load balancer and the private link service. And then we got one backend subnet as well. And then this particular private link service, we will connect to the VNet consumer network by putting a private endpoint. That is what we're trying to achieve in this particular case, right? We're not going to spin up all that backend infrastructure or, on the consumer side, how they're going to consume it. We're just going to see how private link services use in the Azure. All right, let's get on the portal. So on the portal, what I did, just to make sure that we got a network in place, I created two resource group, one for the resource provider called RG provider, and the other one is for the consumer, and then within these particular two resource group, you can see that I got two virtual network, one indicating the provider network and the other one indicating the consumer network. Right. So in the provider network, you can see that there are two subnet provider and the backend. And in the consumer, you can see that there is only one subnet, right? And the most important thing is that there is in this connection. Okay, we're not putting any kind of peering in this case, right? That's minimal. Now, what is that we're going to do? We're going to create a load balancer first. Okay, so let's select the load balancer from the search option and say create. And let's select the resource group, which is provider resource group, because that is where that load balancer would be, right? And we name this particular load balancer as, I think we just name that like provider load balancer, so that we know exactly. And we can leave the SQS standard, type as internal, tier as regional, right? Click on the front end IP configuration and let's add the detail here. We call this configuration as provider, front end IP version. Let's leave as IPv4. Virtual network is selected by default, and we select this subnet, which is subnet provider, and then the remaining thing we can leave as it is. Then click next as backend pool. We go ahead and add some backend pool. Backend pool name, we can say that provider backend pool. Nick have a backend. We just, like, if you got a backend for the service, you can add it, and we just simulating, we're not adding anything here. Click on next, which is inbound rules. And this one, what is that we're gonna do? We are going to add a rule, load balancing rule. We can call it as load balance rule, provider load balance rule, and you select your front end, you select your back end, you leave the things like that, and just put the port 80. You might have a different one, but in this case we're just going to use port 80. We don't have a health probe created, so we're just going to call health probe and set it as 15, nothing more than that, and leave everything as it is and save, right? And we don't need to add any outbound rules in this case, tags, and we can go ahead and say review and create in this case, right? Let's say create, and let's wait for the load balancer to finish. All right, deployment succeeded. That was quick, and our load balancer is in place. Now, what is that we're going to do? We are going to create a private link service. How do we do that? Just search for the private link service. All right, and create the service. Now in this case, we choose the subscription, we select the resource group. Again, this is on the provider side, so we creating in the provider one, and we say that provider private link service, something like that, place in Australia East, and we have to do some kind of outbound setting on this one. So we select the load balancer that we created, we select the front end IP address for the load balancer. Source VNet virtual network is automatically picked up. Source NAT subnet is what we're going to choose, and this is the one in our case, and leave the things as it is. Click next. Access here. Who can request access to your service? We will just keep role-based access control in this particular case. Tag, and you say review and create in this case as well. All right, so validation pass and create this private link service in this case, right? So your load balancer, your backend pool, and your private link service from the provider side is all set in this particular case, right? So once this is created, then we can do the configuration on the consumer side. Think that now the service is up and running, and now consumer would like to utilize this service. So you search for private and we create the private endpoint. Now this one should go in the consumer resource group, and we call it as like a maybe private endpoint for some service, right? So I'm just going to name something like this. It will pick up something like that, and this is where some specific setting you need to understand. Now see, connection method, there are two options. If you are in the same directory, you can choose the first option, but if not, then this is where you need to know the resource ID of the service that you consuming. It is in a different tenant, different subscription, or whatever, wherever in the Azure cloud, right? That is how you can consume. But in our case, we thinking our service is in the same subscription, and we using that service, through the private endpoint. So here we have to select the resource. That resource is going to be private link services, right? That is what we have to choose. And you can see that now provider private link service is coming automatically there. Then we select the virtual network. Now here, this is going to be the consumer side virtual network and the subnet where you want to create the private endpoint, right? We got one subnet on the consumer side, and it is picked up automatically, right? That's fine. And then we have to do some edit here for the network policy for private endpoint. We click on the edit, and here in the edit we have to choose route table and the network security group. So let's choose from this drop down network security group and route tables, and that's it. And we say save. Now it is enabled. Network policy for private endpoint is enabled, right? Then we click next. DNS, we don't need to do anything here as such, and tag and review and create, right? Is pass, and we create the private endpoint for the service which is there in the Azure, right? That is how you basically create the private link service and as a consumer, you use that private link service. That's it. I think once this private endpoint is in place, that means consumer can utilize the IP address that is allocated to this particular NIC card to consume that service, which is again private in nature, right? Is not something exposed to the public, right? So that's it. That's pretty much about this particular demo. So we created the private endpoint, private link service, load balancer. Load balancer has that actual service in the form of backend pool, and consumer is consuming that over the private link. All right, that's all.